Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us at Open Security Summit. This is April 2021, 13th of April. So it's Tuesday. We are joined by Margaux today. She's our first time speaker. So welcome. Before I leave the floor to her, I just want to go through some housekeeping. You guys know, most of you know, and the new guys, you will also know, this is a very collaborative environment, so please feel free to unmute yourself and ask your questions. The more discussion, the better. We don't always have to agree. This is a very open environment, as long as it's within the respect boundaries. So, talk to us about mitigating risks through Bitcoin tracing. It's really, really interesting. I really don't know what to expect. What is it? What is it?
Well, thank you for the introduction. Just before I start my presentation, I just wanted to briefly introduce myself. So as you know, this is my first time speaking at the Open Security Summit. So my name is Margaux Eckle, and I'm currently an associate at Kroll, which is a global investigative consultancy firm. I've been there for a couple of years now, and I've had the opportunity to work on a wide variety of cases, most of them investigative, that range between asset tracing and reputational due diligence. I came across the cybersecurity sector prior to joining Kroll, where I conducted an MSc in information security and digital forensics. And that's where I got in touch with the whole Bitcoin topic, because I had the opportunity to research and study the different tracing opportunities associated to this cryptocurrency throughout my dissertation. So this is basically what I'm going to be speaking to you about today, which is basically the possibilities that we currently have in terms of Bitcoin tracing and investigation, and how these can be useful to mitigating your risks as a company.
That's great. I already have a question.
Oh, great. Go ahead.
You mentioned assets, but assets can mean many different things to many different, many different angles. So when you say assets, what do you mean?
Okay, I use the term asset just because, as you said, it's very broad investigations. I have been involved in actual cryptocurrency tracing investigations, as well as identifying real estate assets, company assets, financial assets associated to an individual. It's been really broad, and I have had the opportunity to touch upon various kinds of tracing exercises whilst working at Kroll. Yeah, just before I start, I just wanted to say once again, for those that arrived a bit later on, I'm in a quite noisy area, so if you ever hear like sirens or cars honking, you know, just ask me to repeat or interrupt, that's fine, but I apologize in advance for that. So mitigating risks through Bitcoin tracing, I'd first like to start with an example of a cryptocurrency related crime. In July of last year, I don't know if you had followed that in the news, a widespread Twitter scam occurred that was referred to as the money heist on social media, whereby a couple of Twitter addresses were advertising a message, the one that you can see on the screen, which enticed users to send them Bitcoin, in exchange of which they would resend said Bitcoins of a doubled value. At first, this message was spread through like a couple of unknown Twitter addresses, but the attackers, gradually gained access to larger Twitter accounts. So we're talking accounts of cryptocurrency companies and other celebrities such as Elon Musk. I think Barack Obama was also involved in this. And they basically advertised that message through those huge accounts. That resulted in 320 transactions sent to the attacker and a loss of 110,000 US dollars, because obviously those who sent the funds never saw them doubled in the end. I just wanted to mention this example because I find it quite illustrative of the rise in cryptocurrency related crimes that we are seeing in recent years, in terms of very boring but quite representative statistical numbers. CipherTrace, which is a cryptocurrency forensic company, indicated that in 2019, cryptocurrency related crime had increased by 150%. and that increase had actually resulted in a loss of $4.5 billion. The question that's interesting to ask is, why this increasing use of cryptocurrency in the perpetration of illicit activities? That's quite an interesting question, but it's not necessarily like the topic of this specific presentation, but a high-level review of information available out there would suggest that illicit actors are quite interested in the properties of cryptocurrency, namely that they think they are secure and that they guarantee total anonymity. The interesting thing, however, is that if you come back to the Twitter money heist, the US Department of Justice, a month after the attack, arrested 3 individuals that were suspected of having conducted said attack. So this really shows that there are possibilities in terms of tracing and investigating cryptocurrency. This is basically what this presentation is about. And before I dive deeper into our topic, I just wanted to try and highlight why you would potentially be interested in actually investigating and tracing Bitcoin. I'm not going to answer this straight away because that's kind of the objective of the presentation, but I'd like you to keep in mind that through this whole process, I'd like to show how having increased knowledge of Bitcoin tracing will help you improve risk prevention, management, and generally speaking, just raise your awareness of the possibilities associated with Bitcoin. Any questions at this stage? No? Okay, I'll continue. So this presentation will be divided in 4 parts. I'll start with a technical presentation of what Bitcoin is. Then I'll go on to an explanation of how to trace Bitcoin transactions. I will continue, so this tracing exercise will lead on to the categorization of Bitcoin addresses. And finally, I'll address the limitations of what can be done. So what is Bitcoin? Just let's start with a brief historical overview, just because some facts are quite interesting. Yes, sorry.
I have a question. So we mentioned Bitcoin, but there are other cryptocurrencies as well. So the things you're going to show, are they very similar in for others?
Not necessarily. This presentation is exclusively focused on Bitcoin. There are a lot of cryptocurrencies with various features. For instance, other cryptocurrencies with enhanced privacy measures won't necessarily apply when it comes to actually investigating them. There'll be other kind of opportunities, but these won't be addressed in this presentation.
Thank you.
No problem. So in terms of a historical overview, Bitcoin was first mentioned at the end of 2008 in a white paper that was published by the anonymous user Satoshi Nakamoto. I say anonymous because that's his username, not real world identity. Bitcoin first appeared on the blockchain in 2009 with the publication of the first block, or the Genesis block, that basically marked the creation of the Bitcoin blockchain. The first payment with Bitcoin occurred in May 2010. It's now very commonly known as the Bitcoin Pizza Day because an online user proposed to pay 2 pizzas, for 100 Bitcoin, payment which was actually accepted by a teenager at the time who must be very wealthy and happy currently. Bitcoin became, or at least I understand that it became quite a mainstream cryptocurrency around 2014, when big companies such as Microsoft started to use and accept it as a means of payment. And then in 2020, as we put forward the Twitter money heist. So Bitcoin is quite interesting in the sense that it is defined by 4 main properties. Well, first of all, as an overview, you might have guessed, it's a cryptocurrency. So basically a digital currency that's secured through the use of encryption. The 4 main properties of Bitcoin are the following. First and foremost, it's secure. It's based on a private public key encryption system, which ensures that the only user who can spend a coin is the user who actually owns it. The second feature is that Bitcoin transactions are irreversible. Once they've been added, once they've taken place and been added to the blockchain, they can't be erased, they can't be modified, they'll just remain on the blockchain forever. Another feature of interest is that Bitcoin transactions are pseudonymous. So there's a common misconception that Bitcoin guarantees anonymity. The concept of anonymity is that a user operating on a platform is completely anonymous, as the name indicates, which means that we literally have no information on said user. But if we look at the blockchain, users interact through Bitcoin addresses, which can be considered as a username or pseudonym. So we actually see and have access to this username. We just don't know by looking at the blockchain who the real world identity of that user is. And finally, the last feature that's interesting to mention is the fact that the blockchain, sorry, not the blockchain, Bitcoin is a decentralized process. This means that whilst transactions are not permissionless, they aren't checked. They're going to be validated, but the object of the transaction, the amounts transacted, that's completely free, and there are no limitations or controls implemented on them at this time. So I'm going to basically look at each of these properties in a bit more detail and give a presentation of, the technical aspect of how Bitcoin works. Again, this can get, it's quite a lot of information, so please feel free to interrupt if you want to discuss anything further. So first, I'm going to address the secure system in which Bitcoin evolves, really. As we've mentioned, it's based on a private public key encryption system, which was initially developed by Ron Rivest, Adi Shamir, and Leonard Edelman in 1977. It's commonly known as RSA cryptography. It's this asymmetric cryptography system whereby each user has a different key, one key that enables to encrypt the message, whereas the other enables the user to decrypt it. This system is illustrated here. So basically in Bitcoin, the way that it works is that the message to be encrypted are the coins located on a Bitcoin address. The Bitcoin address in turn acts as the public key. In order to encrypt the coins and therefore lock access to them, a user will use his public key, which you can see normally here on the left. And in order to decrypt that message and subsequently access the coins that were previously locked, a user will need to use the private key associated with the public key used to block the funds. Now onto the irreversible blockchain. A brief definition of the blockchain is that it's a digital ledger that records information. The interesting thing to keep in mind here is that the blockchain is not specific to Bitcoin. It's basically a platform that can be used for lots of different things, but it just happens to be used by Bitcoin. And so in the Bitcoin system, information are the transactions, and they're gathered in blocks, which subsequently form the blockchain. So this kind of blockchain can be compared to a Lego tower, which might seem a bit childish, but let's just assume that the transactions are little bricks that are then piled together to form blocks, which are then added to the tower, which is the blockchain as a whole. Once information is added to that Lego tower, it is spread through a peer-to-peer network through a system of nodes. So this basically means that information is not updated in only one location, but throughout a whole network of nodes.
So in a way that when the Lego blocks come together, they melt together. So you cannot put one.
Exactly. That's the concept that I was going to address just here, which is the reason why the blockchain or information on the blockchain is irreversible is because, so the reasons are twofold. The first is exactly as you mentioned. Once you add information to the blockchain, you're basically adding a block. In order to change this block, you would have to change all the blocks that arrived afterwards. But since information is constantly added to the blockchain, that's a near impossible feat. The second thing that makes it completely irreversible is that you've got multiple contributors to the blockchain. It's not one user that's validating everything and then adding the information onto that platform. So in order to change the information on the blockchain, you would have to gain approval from all the users that are contributing to this platform. Again, not something that you can feasibly do. Does that more or less answer the question or the general query, I think?
Would it be possible to use that if with one of the new currencies, for example, if it is not distributed to a lot of people, would you be able to attack that? But anyway, this is not the
No, it's actually a really interesting question. To be honest, I don't think this is my opinion, and it's not necessarily educated in the sense that I don't have enough experience with dealing with other cryptocurrency to actually assess the size of the blockchain associated with them. But I would assume that even a small, or at least like a non-spread cryptocurrency would still have enough users that like the system would be protected by the kind of network that it evolves in.
I guess those initial people, they have to have an initial trust between themselves and
exactly, yeah. But then again, it is true that there's a need for trust. But as I said, you can't change the blockchain with just one user determining to change it. So even if you start a blockchain with like 5 users, you would need the agreement of those 5 users to actually implement a fraudulent action in the blockchain.
awesome. Yeah, thank you.
No problem. So those are the honks I was talking about, so sorry. Anyway, we've mentioned the irreversible blockchain. Let's go on to the pseudonymous transactions. So as you've guessed, Bitcoin transactions occur between 2 or more Bitcoin addresses. Bitcoin addresses, as I mentioned, are the same thing as a public key in the private public encryption system, and they can also be seen as the pseudonym or username of a Bitcoin user.
Is that also the wallet? Is that?
No, that's very different. Basically, so Bitcoin addresses are assigned a value, which refers to the number of coins that they contain. And so Bitcoin trading occurs between different Bitcoin addresses. A Bitcoin wallet is purely a managerial tool. So it's basically going to regroup multiple Bitcoin addresses, and it will enable a user to, it's basically enabling a user to manage his portfolio of assets, but it doesn't hold a value in itself. It's just an organizational tool. So transactions occur between various addresses. And so now going a bit more into the detail of how an actual transaction takes place. This is illustrated in the graph in front of us. So let us take 2 users. On the left, user A, and on the right, user B. User A wants to send coins to user B, which are represented in the big B in the middle. The situation as it is that user A currently owns these coins, which are locked by his public key or Bitcoin address A. In order to send those coins to user B, user A will first decrypt or unlock the coins through the use of the private key associated with his Bitcoin address. And he will then relock those coins using the public address associated with user B. User A knows the public address associated with user B because this address is openly available on the blockchain. Once the funds have been locked with the public key of user B, said user just needs to go to the funds and unlock them with the private key that is known only to him. That is basically how a transfer of funds operates in the Bitcoin system. It's actually quite interesting because when you think about it, coins are never actually transferred. It's just a change of ownership, but the container basically remains the same. They remain in the same location. On the blockchain, a transaction looks basically like this. So I got this from the Block Explorer blockchain.com. A transaction is represented by a unique transaction ID, which you can see here near the hash, and it represents the input addresses on the left and the output addresses on the right. You also have information as to the amount of Bitcoin traded, as well as the date on which it took place. The fee that's mentioned here, I'm going to illustrate that and explain it a bit later on. In this section, I'd just like to mention what change addresses are. In a Bitcoin address, so if you take 2 Bitcoin addresses trading between each other, so let's take again our example of user A. User A is going to use Bitcoin address A to send funds to user B. Imagine he holds 5 Bitcoin in his Bitcoin address A, but only wants to send 3 to user B. He doesn't have the possibility to just send 3. He has to send the whole value contained in Bitcoin address A. The way this works is that he will send 3 Bitcoin to user B, and then the remaining 2 to a change address, which also belongs to him. So the change address basically receives the remaining coins or the change of a transaction. I hope that was clear. But, you know, again, interrupt if at one point something needs to happen. Okay.
I guess it's not too crucial to understand that bit technically.
Quite a bit, but it's more like the idea is just like this change address is the same thing as the buyer receiving change for his purchase.
Mm-hmm.
That's basically what it represents.
So
I would say.
First line here, both the left side and the right side is owned by person A.
Yes, exactly. I'll go more into that methodology a bit later on, but that's exactly the right idea. Okay, and so now onto the fourth property that we mentioned in our introduction, which is the decentralized validation process. After a transaction takes place, it needs to be validated in order to be added to the blockchain. It's validated by a peer-to-peer network. So these peers are actually miners who will check if the transaction is authentic and will also check that there's no double spending. So for instance, that this transaction didn't already take place with the same funds, if that makes sense. In order to validate that transaction, miners need to solve a mathematical problem called proof of work, which generally is a lot of guessing work, which is based on a lot of processing power. And so through that, they will validate multiple transactions that will form a block once validated. The first miner to actually solve the problem is the one who will validate the block and add it to the blockchain. And once that is done, they will receive a validation fee for the mining of that block, as well as transaction fees, which is what we see here on the left, which is a fee associated with each transaction in the block that they've validated and added to the blockchain. So that was the end of the technical aspect of Bitcoin. Before I go on to the tracing exercise, does anyone have any questions or misunderstandings? I understand it was a lot of information, but I'd rather, you know, respond to your questions now so that you understand the next steps better. So don't hesitate.
Yeah, don't be shy to ask questions, everyone. You can unmute and ask. Or if you're shy or in a very loud environment, you can post in the chat window and I can voice them for you.
I'm sure you can't top ambulances, but in any case, you know, feel free to interrupt and I can continue until a query comes up. So now on to tracing Bitcoin transactions, now that we know a bit more how all of this works. Before we actually go on to, you know, tracing funds coming from a particular address and being traded through a particular transaction, it's important to actually be able to identify a Bitcoin address or transaction on the blockchain. I think the blockchain can be thought, broadly speaking, as the equivalent of the internet. It contains a lot of information through which you can browse. And so in order to browse through that information, you would need an engine browser. That is what block explorers are. They're basically the blockchain equivalent to your Chrome or Firefox. And they were described by Binance as a tool that provides detailed analytics about a blockchain network since its first day at the Genesis block. There are a lot of block explorers. For the purpose of this exercise, I'm going to use one, which is blockchain.com, which is the one I also generally use at work. But you can have others with, you know, more diversified features, graph abilities, visualization tools, sorry, and things like that. So once you've actually found your block explorer, or at least the one you want to use, the next step is to identify your Bitcoin transaction on the blockchain. There are multiple scenarios through which you can do that, depending on the type of information that is available to you when you start your research. The first scenario is the best one, you actually have access to the unique transaction hash or ID. So you're just going to chuck that in your block explorer, and it's going to lead you directly to the transaction that you're interested in, which is what can be seen in the screenshot here, where the transaction is ID'd by the hash, and you have your output, input addresses, date, and fees / transaction amounted, traded.
As this is in an investigative way, I guess you already have that address problem.
Not necessarily, actually. In some instances, which are the other scenarios, so scenario 2, for instance, you would only have a Bitcoin address and other information such as a date or a value transacted. Again, you'll be able to input that in your block explorer, and what happens is you're going to get information on that address. So the block explorer, as can be seen in the screenshot here, will provide the number of transactions it was involved in, the amount of Bitcoin it received, the amount it sent, and the address's final balance. You can't really see it here, but you also have a list of all the transactions that it was involved in, which is where the date or the amount transacted is useful to identify the transaction that you actually want to follow.
I see. Scenario 1, I think.
Sorry, go ahead.
I made you skip scenario 1.
No, so scenario 1 was the one that I mentioned, which was, with a transaction ID and finding that transaction directly on the blockchain. It was a very good transition to scenario 2. And in scenario 3, you actually don't have any transaction ID, you don't have a Bitcoin address. You just know that at a certain amount in time, at a specific date, there was a specific number of Bitcoin that were transacted. If you've got the exact number of Bitcoin transacted, you can actually find that transaction again on the blockchain. There are 2 ways of doing that, either browsing through the blockchain and trying to determine which block that transaction is in. That's very time consuming, very lengthy, and there's way more efficient ways of doing it, which is putting that information into an advanced Google search using Boolean operators. And if you're lucky, or no, not even lucky, but most of the time you'll actually find the transaction that you're looking for on the block explorer of your choice, just because it's quite rare that you would have 2 transactions on the same date that trade with the same exact number of Bitcoin. So once you've actually identified your address and the transaction of interest on the blockchain, you can start following the coin. For the purpose of this exercise, we're going to use the Bitcoin address here, which we're going to call 13 AM because the whole name would just take too long. We've conducted a brief analysis of that address prior to starting the tracing. So just by looking at information that was provided by the Blockchain Explorer, we saw that it had been involved in 142 transactions, and that of these 142, it was only the input address in 2 transactions, which means that on 140 instances, it received coins, but it only sent out coins on 2 occasions. Our transaction of interest is the one that is shown in the screenshot below, which is basically the address 13 AM receiving 0.218 funds from the input address on the left. The idea here will be to find where those 0.218 Bitcoin went afterwards. So we know that they could only have been transferred through those 2 Bitcoin transactions that the address was involved in, the outgoing transactions. We managed to identify the one that is of relevance to us, because if you look at the input addresses on the left, you see that on the 5th line, you've got the exact amount of Bitcoin that 13 AM had received, which is subsequently sent out to those 2 output addresses that you can see on the right. Again, please don't hesitate to interrupt me here. It can get a bit confusing at times. So now that we know where 13 AM4 actually sent its money, we're going to try and look where it went after that. So our investigation is going to go 2 separate ways. Sorry.
You go 1 back slide.
Yeah.
So in here, in here is 13 a.m. is on the right. Okay, so they
Yeah.
received this money and then.
So in this instance, they actually received money from the address on the left.
Okay.
The amount is 0.218 approximately. And in a transaction that occurred after the one where it received the funds, it sent those funds to those two addresses. At this stage in time, we're going to have to split our investigation because we have two output addresses, which means that we're going to follow the money in two different directions. Firstly, we're going to look at address 1ARI. So that is.
And you knew this, the first one was not a change address because the total amount is the amount total of the two amounts up there, or?
So the first one actually is a change address, interestingly enough, as we'll see later on. It's a change address because basically the amount sent to the first output address is covered by each individual input address. So basically, if it had been an address to which they actually wanted to send the funds, they wouldn't have needed that many multiple addresses in the input list. But we'll see that a bit later on. It's quite interesting as well. But nice spot. So at this point in time, we're going to split our investigation and first look at the funds that went to the first address, so 1ARI. That is the step 2.A of our investigation. If we look at this address on the blockchain, we see that it was only involved in one other transaction after this one. So once it had received the funds from 13AM4, it then sent them out to another address, this one on the right. That was the first fork of our investigation. If we go back to the other address to which 13AM4 sent funds, so the second one, by looking at it on the blockchain, we also see that it was only involved in one other transaction subsequent to this one. So it sent out the funds elsewhere after that, and that's it. It sent the funds to these two addresses here. The goal of this exercise is not obviously to trace the funds back indefinitely. It's just to show you the process through which you can actually follow the money through the blockchain. It's important to keep in mind, however, that it's not a mindless task. So just by following the coin as we've done now, we've managed to do what's represented on the graph, which is follow the coin through various addresses and identify different Bitcoin addresses that are of relevance to us and our investigation. However, as I've mentioned, you need to apply some level of analysis to it. So that's where your point on change addresses comes in. When tracing a coin, or just Bitcoin funds in general, you're supposed to apply something that's called clustering methodologies. Clustering addresses is the process through which we identify which addresses are controlled by the same user, which means that we can actually find and create links between Bitcoin addresses. It's important here to distinguish between control and ownership of a Bitcoin address. A user that controls an address generally knows the private key and can trade the funds, but it doesn't necessarily mean that he owns the funds. If you look at an exchange service, they're going to control multiple Bitcoin addresses, but generally on behalf of other users. They're going to exchange the fund, but they don't necessarily own them. There are two current methodologies to identify addresses that are part of the same cluster. This is a process that's in constant development. So it is completely possible that in a week, another heuristic will come up and my analysis will be flawed and lacking. But for now, these are the two main ones. The first is the multi-input heuristic. The idea behind that is if in a Bitcoin transaction you have multiple input addresses, these will be controlled by the same user, and so therefore will be part of the same cluster. The other methodology is based on change addresses. And so the idea is that once you've identified a change address in a transaction, you can safely say that the owner controlling that address is the same as the one controlling the input addresses. So we're going to try and apply that methodology to the tracing exercise that we did previously. So we're going to look at the transaction when 13 a.m. actually sent out the funds that it had initially received. So as you mentioned very well here, the first output address is a change address because 13 a.m. only sent 0.1 BTC to them. But if you look at the input addresses, each input address has more than 0.1 BTC. So if the objective was to actually send funds to the first output address, they wouldn't have needed that many input addresses. So that leads us to conclude that 1ARIR is the change address for 13AM4, and that they are therefore part of the same cluster. If we go further in our tracing exercise to the transaction whereby 1ARI sent funds outside of its Bitcoin address, we see that the transaction in which it was involved also involved two other input addresses. So in this stage, according to the multi-input heuristic, we can also infer that these three addresses are part of the same cluster. Yes, I didn't know if that was.
So what if in the previous slide, the first transaction, the first output address received like 0.2?
In that case, we wouldn't have been able to. So if it had received, let's take another example. If it had actually received like, I don't know, 1.2, and that none of the input transaction was enough on an individual basis to send those funds, then it would have been difficult to conclude that it was a change address, which is why those are heuristics. We're talking about academic research that has been applied in investigative work, but there's always a margin of error, and it's not always, like you're not always going to be able to cluster. There are some limitations to what you can actually do.
Yeah, I understand.
So through this exercise, which can be summed up here, we managed to see that like the 4 addresses of the multiple ones that we had found during our tracing exercise, well, these specific 4 addresses were controlled, or at least we think, with reason, are controlled by the same user. That's interesting just because it enables to cluster addresses around the same individual, and just basically speaking, increase our chances of actually finding information on this individual by investigating these addresses. Which leads me to
I have a question again.
Yeah, no, go ahead. That's great.
Okay. I wish these were all questions coming from the audience. But so that person in the middle, you mentioned it can also be like an exchange.
Completely.
Yeah, and can it also be like a Tumblr?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Any kind of individual entity, service provider, marketplace, drug, trader, anything.
Okay, anyone who has the control of these Bitcoins for
exactly
a period of time. They don't have to own them.
So they don't necessarily own the funds on the addresses, but they are aware of the private key and are able to trade with them.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the general idea. And so once we've actually managed to trace those funds and cluster some of these addresses, linking them to a common entity, that is when we're going to start researching them and actually categorizing a Bitcoin address and the associated user's behavior. In order to do that, we're going to try and gather information on these Bitcoin addresses. The goal will be either to identify the user controlling the address. That's generally fairly rare, but what we can do is analyze the address's activities and subsequently the user's behavior behind it. There are 3 main sources of information for a Bitcoin address. The first is the blockchain, then we have the surface web, and of course the dark web in some cases. The information that can be found on the blockchain is primarily threefold. we're going to find information relating to the transaction activity of an address. So we're talking here about transactional history, evolution of balance over time, the various users that it traded with, information as such. The other two types of information I'm putting here because I do think they're important, but I would advise to tread with caution when using them. The first is time zones. On the blockchain, each transaction has a timestamp. This timestamp was awarded to the transaction once it was mined, validated, and added to the blockchain. What we can do with this information is that for a specific Bitcoin user, we could analyze the temporal patterns of his or her activity and see when during the day they're actually trading, and subsequently infer from that, you know, their time zone, possible location, language they speak, etc. The thing is, whilst conducting this analysis, we're assuming that a certain user is active only during a specific time span during the day, but it's completely possible that they're trading only at night just to throw us off the scent. So there is a specific limitation to keep in mind when looking at time zones. The other information is IP addresses. Having interacted a lot with investigators at work, this is not something that's necessarily taken seriously. I think the term utter bollocks was also raised in relation to IP addresses found on the blockchain. Basically, the idea is that there was a string of research that was conducted into IP addresses relating to Bitcoin nodes. And there was this assumption that the blockchain provided information on the IP address of the first user who had transferred the information relating to a specific Bitcoin address. The general idea was that this first node that transferred the information was associated to the user who had actually been involved in the transaction. This was found to obviously not necessarily be the case. So basically, if you do look at an IP address associated with a transaction, it's not the IP address of the user, but rather the IP address of the node that first transferred the information. If we take, again, our example of address 13 AM and look at what we can find on the blockchain, we're going to focus here on transaction analysis. A good open source tool to actually analyze these transactions is oxt.me, which is basically a visual graph-based platform which will illustrate the transaction activities of a specific Bitcoin address. So for this address, we see that it was involved, again, in 142 transactions, that it was involved in 140 incoming transactions as opposed to 2 outgoing ones. The interesting thing here is that all those transactions, or at least most of them, took place over a couple of months surrounding May 2017. Another point of interest is if we actually look at the volumes traded during that period, even though it was involved only in 2 outgoing transactions, the volumes that were sent out of the address were approximately the same as the ones that they had received. Again, this is over a very short period of time, around May 2017.
And there's a giveaway on that screenshot.
Yep. Oh, yeah. But I'm building up the suspense. I mean, obviously that now you're aware, but you'll see. It's interesting. So that was basically what we can infer from the blockchain. As we mentioned previously, another source of information would be the web. There are various locations that you can check on the surface web and dark web to get information. The first is just basic engine browsing. The issue is if there were to be information on your Bitcoin address, generally it's a lot of information. So it's always useful to use Boolean operators, Google advanced searches, in order to restrict your search and just make it more efficient. Another good source of analysis would be social media and forums. So there are a lot of forums dedicated solely to Bitcoin, such as Bitcoin Talk and such. Good information sources also include Reddit, because it's basically users who will either talk about a Bitcoin address or even services that will advertise their addresses. So it's always good to check there because, you know, it's quite an exhaustive source of information. especially in the context of attacks and frauds and such.
Are you able to like make searches with the names of the attacker groups, like there are known ransomware groups who might like the WannaCry one?
Yeah, well, completely. In a case like the address that we're looking at now, if we were to input that in our browser, we would soon discover that there are a lot of sources of information that relate it to the WannaCry attack. I've got tons of examples in the next slide, but basically, from the moment that it's mentioned on the web, you'll be able to find where it is mentioned without necessarily knowing the name of the ransomware that it was involved in.
In the engine browse, in the engine, I could just write Pseudonymous or something, and it can tell me.
So if you're like, this is an example of inputting that address in your browser. So it's basically a copy paste. For the purpose of this exercise, I did use the -block operator just to restrict the number of results that came up and just make them more relevant. You can see here that the first result will be bitcoinabuse.com, which flags the address as being fraudulent. If you look further into social media and forums, again, this will pop up in your browser search, but just looking at various platforms, you'll see that it was associated with the WannaCry ransomware attack as one of the 3 addresses that had received the funds from companies paying the ransom. That's a very interesting piece of information, especially considering the fact that when that attack occurred, there were a lot of open source investigators that actually published through blogs and social media their attempts at actually tracing those coins. So any kind of information that could assist us in our research. But yes, definitely looking at the forums, there is no doubt anymore that this address is one of the 3 that was linked to the ransomware attack. And if we go further even and look at open source tools that are specific to Bitcoin, such as Bitcoin Who's Who, which is basically a platform that reports on fraudulent Bitcoin addresses, we see that this address is flagged as fraudulent. And there's a list of websites further down on the site where it's mentioned, along with all the scams that it's been associated to, i.e. WannaCry in this specific example. There are other tools that are quite useful when studying Bitcoin that can help automate the whole tracing and information gathering process. One of them is Wallet Explorer, which will automate the clustering process, which is also quite useful in saving us time and being more efficient. So what we've seen with these, well, I mean, what we've seen here in this address, with this address 13 AM, is that obviously linked to the WannaCry attack, we found information on it. There are plenty of results that come up. It's quite useful. We're very aware of the type of activity that this address engages in, not necessarily the users behind it, but quite a lot of information to, as a company, make up your mind as to whether you should trade with it or not. In a lot of cases, however, you don't necessarily have a lot of information through open source on a specific Bitcoin address. That doesn't necessarily mean that your investigation will stop here. This is where I'm going to address user behavior categorization. As we've seen earlier on, you have information on the blockchain. For whatever Bitcoin address that you're looking at, you will always have information on its transaction activity, on its patterns of behavior, basically on how it acts on the blockchain. By just looking at this information, you can infer the type of user that might be behind a Bitcoin address. So just categorize its behavior and maybe associate it to a type of service. It means that you're not necessarily identifying the user behind it, but maybe the type of user behind it. If we look at an exchange service, for instance, and an address associated with that type of service, if we look at their activity on the blockchain, we see that they're involved, as we can see here, in a very high number of transactions. The fact that we're counting transactions in the 4,000s means that it's quite unlikely that it's an individual user actually transacting. Additionally, we see that basically the outgoing transactions, so transactions where funds are sent out of the address, occur shortly after the incoming transactions, which means that the address is receiving funds and then shortly after it's sending out funds. And finally, if you look at the volumes traded, we see that the funds that are actually coming into the address are sent out the exact same volume shortly after. So this basically illustrates the activity of an exchange. We're talking large transactions, regular transactions, incoming and outgoing transactions that, take place in a quite short amount of time, and the amount received is generally immediately spent. So if we look at that and know that it belongs to an exchange service, were we to look at an address that we know nothing about and see the exact same type of behavior, we could, with some certainty, assume and infer that it also belongs to a service that's quite the same as an exchange. And this has been a subject of research recently that has actually resulted in the creation of a number of tools that automate this process. And basically what happens is that academics are going to study the behavior associated with different types of service. So we're talking about exchanges, mixing services, ransomware or fraudulent addresses, or even just, simple non-malicious trading services. For each of these clusters, they'll analyze the behavior of the Bitcoin addresses. And so when a new one comes in that they know nothing about, they'll be able to assimilate it with one of these services. So again, as a company, it's quite useful as it allows you to know a bit more about the type of activity an address will be transacting into. So has everyone kind of managed to follow the whole user behavior categorization thing, or should I go over that quickly a bit?
No, you're good. You're good.
Okay, cool, great. So that was basically looking at what we can do in terms of, categorizing an address's behavior and tracing funds to a specific, location or entity. Of course, there are limitations to this whole investigative process. If it were that easy, everybody would be doing it. Bitcoin would have no security or pseudonymity whatsoever, and it just generally wouldn't be necessarily used. So there are a lot, or at least growing limitations on Bitcoin tracing. I'm going to highlight 3 in this presentation. The first is associated with just the nature of Bitcoin. The second with the increasing use of obfuscation services. And the last will just be limitations associated with open source. Bitcoin properties. As you might have guessed from the technical presentation of Bitcoin, we're talking about huge, huge volumes of information. So when browsing on the blockchain, you're going to have to sort through thousands of transactions, large amounts of information. And so it's basically a research, especially when it's done manually, that is time consuming and most importantly, prone to errors. Additionally, the nature of Bitcoin in itself is that it's pseudonymous. So while we've seen that there are things that we can do with that and types of research that we can actually derive from a Bitcoin address, it remains difficult because we have no idea about the actual real world identity of a user behind a Bitcoin address. Having spoken to a lot of colleagues that are actually currently involved in cryptocurrency investigations, there's this widespread understanding and acknowledgement that if a user knows what he's doing, i.e. isn't under the impression that Bitcoin will make him Superman that can also be invisible, and actually puts in the effort to create new Bitcoin addresses, go through exchanges and stuff like that. Just generally speaking, if the guy is technically savvy, it will be extremely difficult to investigate the transactions in which he is involved. Finally, there is a limitation that's a bit less relevant to a company, but which is important when investigating this from maybe a police perspective, which is that there are limitations associated with inferred evidence. So for example, if by looking at the activity of a Bitcoin address, you infer that it could belong to an exchange because it has similar activity patterns, that's great, but it's not hard evidence. You can't really back it up. So in a court of law, or just, as a way to find your assets again, it's going to be difficult to justify, and that can create a sort of roadblock. Another type of limitation that we've encountered in our investigations is just the increasing use of obfuscation services. What are those? It's basically the idea that when a transaction occurs between user A and user B, these services will be used and it will cut the link of the transaction. So basically you won't be able to link the funds sent by user B and the funds sent by user A, and the funds received by user B anymore, as we did during our follow the coin exercise. There are multiple obfuscation services that we can see here. The first are exchange services, which inherently speaking are absolutely not illicit in any way. It's just that they're being increasingly used by illicit actors to hide the source and destination of their funds. So exchange services, as you probably know, are platforms which offer to exchange cryptocurrencies for other currencies, either fiat or other digital currencies. They introduce two main difficulties. The first is actually identifying that an exchange service has been used when following coins on the blockchain. And the second will be that once coins have actually gone through an exchange, it means that the platform on which we're investigating them changes entirely. So for instance, if you exchange your Bitcoin for Moneros, your blockchain is actually going to change. The modalities of your investigation are going to change. Basically, you're going to go onto a whole new platform, whole new system. What can be done with exchange services at this point, especially when you investigate those cryptocurrencies in association with police forces, for instance, is that if you are able to actually identify an exchange, and if that exchange also implements KYC or know your client procedures, you can actually go to them and with reasonable justification and, paperwork, I guess, you can obtain from them that they would provide information on the email address of the user that used the service.
Do they have to comply, or can they just say?
So no. So basically, if I, as an individual or through a private company, went to them asking for that, they would absolutely not have to comply. But in a case where, I don't know, you've
law enforcement
flagged law enforcement, you flagged fraudulent activity to law enforcement or collaborate with them, it is something that is in the scope of possibilities. Another type of obfuscation services include mixing services, or tumblers, as you called them very correctly before. These are platforms which mix coins belonging to several users and then sends them back to the users. But basically the idea is that the coins sent back to a user are not the same that they initially sent to the service. So if you take user A, B, and C, they all send their coins to the mixing service. This service tumblers them, mixes them together, and then they'll send back the exact same amount of coins, except the coins that user A will be getting might be the coins from user B or user C, or a mix of them. Tumblers have been increasingly used to perpetrate money laundering activities, because illicit actors will actually send tainted coins, i.e. money that was used for illicit activity, and get back clean coins, therefore obfuscating the link between the bad coins and the good coins in a way. Other similar types of services are gambling services and just like online betting sites. The reason why they're so attractive is because they generally have very limited know your client procedures, which means that users can just send coins, make a bet, and get untainted coins in exchange without leaving a trace at the actual service. The last issue that we've encountered are just privacy enhancing measures that have been implemented by Bitcoin. So these are twofold. The first are measures that, again, aim to obfuscate the flow of funds. So we've got different services that have implemented that. The first is fair exchange. The principle of fair exchange is that the service swaps coins belonging to two users. So it's kind of the same principle as a mixing service. Users will send coins to fair exchange, who then will send coins back, but which are not the ones that initially belong to them. Another obfuscation service would be coin swap. So this allows two parties that are trading to go through an intermediary. So for instance, imagine user A wants to send funds to user B. That user will first send the funds to user C, who will then in turn send them to user B, but the funds sent to user B will not be the ones received by user A initially. Again, this is a way of, cutting the link between two users. Another type of privacy enhancing measure implemented by Bitcoin is stealth addresses. That's quite similar to the way Moneros works currently. That doesn't necessarily obfuscate the flow of funds, but it hides the public address of a user. So basically, when user A transacts with user B, his Bitcoin address will be replaced by another Bitcoin address, which is valid for a unique point in time for that transaction. So that's complicated for us because until now, the Bitcoin address is what we've relied on to carry out our investigation.
I've got a question.
Yes.
Is that why Moneros are now taking over the dark web, because they have this additional security? I mean, obscurity feature.
Yes, completely.
Is there anything else that they add to the whole picture that it's now more used?
So from what I understand, and this again is with a limited knowledge of Moneros, is basically that they use stealth addresses. So when two users interact or transact using Moneros, the Bitcoin addresses that they use, their actual public addresses will be hidden from users outside of this specific transaction. So if you look at the blockchain associated with Moneros, you're going to see the transaction. You're going to see a transaction that occurred between two addresses. However, these two addresses are a one-time thing. They don't have any other link to the users. They can't be traced back to the users. And the actual public addresses associated with the users cannot be seen.
How do
they like tokens?
Sorry?
Are they like tokens then, in that sense? They're just one time.
Yeah, more or less, yeah. Except tokens refers more to like a means of trade rather than address. But yeah, that's more or less the same thing.
But how does the whole block validate? How does it get validated if the people don't have enough information about it?
Because the transaction doesn't get validated due to the information that people have on it. It's just a question of making sure that those same funds weren't already transacted. And there's an awareness of like the funds that were transacted. And so I guess that through the mining process, the people that actually mine the transactions probably have more information than just
so it's about the
normal
coin
users.
rather than the addresses. Okay.
I would think so. And this comes from, very brief high level research on that specific type of cryptocurrency. But I mean, it's definitely the next step in like cryptocurrency tracing. I can't guarantee that it would actually lead to something, but it's definitely a topic on which I want to research further. But at this stage, like, I'm sorry, I can't give you that much more explanation as to how it works.
Oh, it's great. You answered all.
But yeah, and I to answer the question more in depth, I would assume that Moneros has other privacy enhancing measures. But from what I understand, the one that they share with that they could potentially share with Bitcoin is those stealth addresses. The fact is, those privacy enhancing measures at this time are quite unused. People are not necessarily aware of them. So it means that there are still possibilities in tracing Bitcoin transactions as they're not, widespread on the Bitcoin blockchain. which is completely different from Monero's, considering that with Monero's, they're implemented in the service already. They're not kind of an add-on that's optional in a way.
Cool, thanks.
No problem. So that was basically addressing the increasing use of privacy enhancing measures. A last limitation that we've encountered, especially through OSINT investigations, is just the limitation of open source, really. In the current tools that exist, there are significant flaws. First of all, the fact that some of the open source tools require significant technical knowledge as well as processing power. If we look at commercial software and databases, whilst they're a bit more reliable, there is a certain cost associated with them, obviously. We can encounter a lot of false positives or even false negatives using those open source tools. And even if we were to rely on commercial software and proprietary databases, there is just a moment where, as Benjamin Strick, who is an OSINT investigator, said, open source investigations stop. Not everything is out there. So, for example, if we come back to the exchange that we were looking at earlier on, if we were to encounter said exchange throughout our follow the coin process and were to identify the exchange, well, that would be great, but that would show the limitations of our open source methods, because as we've mentioned, we can't then go as individuals to the exchange and be like, give me that information, pretty please. So whilst OSINT can do a lot, it can only do so much. So in order to conclude my presentation, I'd just like to go back to the slide that I introduced at the beginning, which is basically, why would you be interested? And what I'm hoping to have achieved through this presentation is to show you how gaining knowledge a bit more on Bitcoin tracing, Bitcoin investigations, has enabled you to determine how you could improve the risk prevention and management within your company. So let's look at risk prevention. We've assessed how it was possible to determine the behavior of a Bitcoin address to determine the activities it engages in. I would hope that if tomorrow you came across an individual who asked you to send him funds on that 13 a.m. address, you would not. In terms of risk management, if you were actually the victim of a fraud or a widespread scam targeted attack, I think that this presentation has managed to show you that it is possible, even if not conducted by yourself, to actually trace the funds that you lost or that have been fraudulently acquired through the blockchain. This is not to say that you would necessarily get them back, but there are possibilities. They're not ultimately lost straight away. There are opportunities to go after them. And finally, if I haven't managed to convince you at all on the risk prevention and management side, I'm hoping that at least I raised some awareness as to the usage of Bitcoin, in the sense that, as we mentioned, cryptocurrency-related crime is on the rise. Companies are increasingly trading in Bitcoin, other cryptocurrencies, and as such, it is important to be aware of how those currencies work, what possibilities are associated to them, and what are the limitations. So there we go. Thank you for listening. And yeah, if you have any questions, please feel free. And otherwise, well, you have my LinkedIn, so reach out whenever you want.
Questions from anybody? It was really good. I loved it. It's, yeah, there are many many people are clapping for you. Thank you so much.
Oh, great. That's positive. Thank you. Thank you.
So would you like to share your Twitter?
Yeah, I don't think that I have any. Well, I actually do, but it's very empty. I will. I'll. Where can I share it? Is it on this chat, or can I just?
You can share in this chat, and if you would like to become a member on our Slack channel, where
I think I am actually. I'll probably just send the Twitter there. It'll probably be easier, because to be honest, I don't use it enough to actually remember my username. I should probably change. But yeah, okay. Well, I'll share that, and thank you very much for listening.
Also, thank you very much. It was
also we can find you on LinkedIn, Margaux, as well.
Yeah. Okay.
Like if anyone wants to contact you, they can contact you on LinkedIn.
Yeah,
Good
definitely.
presentation. It was really interesting. Really, really good.
I'm glad. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everybody.
Bye.